All right, so now we'll do part 4. So, my fourth recording, and we're in the middle of chapter 28, The Madness of Mr. Crouch. So, Harry and Crumb were just walking away. All right. What are we going this way for? Said Harry as they passed Hagrid's cabin and the illuminated Beauxbaton carriage. Don't want to be overheard, said Crumb shortly. When at last they had reached a quiet stretch of ground, a short way from the Beauxbaton horses' paddock, Crumb stopped in the shade of the trees and turned to face Harry. I want to know, he said, glowering, what there is between you and Hermione. Harry, who, for Crumb's secretive manner, had expected something much more serious than this, stared up at Crumb in amazement. Nothing, he said. But Crumb glowered at him, and Harry, somehow struck anew by how tall Crumb was, elaborated. We're friends. She's not my girlfriend, and she never has been. It's just that Skeeter woman making things up. Hermione talks about you very often, said Crumb, looking suspiciously at Harry. Yeah, said Harry, because we're friends. He couldn't quite believe he was having this conversation with Victor Crumb, the famous international Quidditch player. It was as though the 18-year-old Crumb thought he, Harry, was an equal, a real rival. You have not. No, said Harry very firmly. Crumb looked slightly happier. He stared at Harry for a few seconds, then said, You fly very well. I was watching you at the first task. Thanks, said Harry, grinning broadly and suddenly feeling much taller himself. I saw you at the Quidditch World Cup. The Wronski feint. You really... But something moved behind Crumb in the trees, and Harry, who had some experience of the sort of thing that lurked in the forest, instinctively grabbed Crumb's arm and pulled him around. What is it? Harry shook his head, staring at the place where he'd seen movement. He slipped his hand inside his robes, reaching for his wand. Suddenly, a man staggered out from behind the tall oak. For a moment, Harry didn't recognize him. Then he realized it was Mr. Crouch. He looked as though he had been traveling for days. The knees of his robes were ripped and bloody, his face scratched. He was unshaven and gray with exhaustion. His neat hair and mustache were both in need of a wash and trim. His strange appearance, however, was nothing to the way he was behaving. Muttering and gesticulating, Mr. Crouch appeared to be talking to someone aloud that he alone could see. He reminded Harry vividly of an old tramp he had once seen when out shopping with the Dursleys. That man, too, had been having a wild conversation in thin air. Aunt Petunia had seized Dudley's hand and pulled him across the road to avoid him. Uncle Vernon had then treated the family to a long rant about what he would do with beggars and vagrants. Wasn't he a judge? Said Crumb, staring at Mr. Crouch. Isn't he with your ministry? Harry nodded, hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly toward Mr. Crouch, who did not look at him but continued to talk to a nearby tree. And when you've done that, Weatherby, send an owl to Dumbledore confirming the number of Durmstrang students who will be attending the tournament. Karkaroff has just sent word he has 12. Mr. Crouch, said Harry cautiously, and then send another owl to Madame Maxime because she might want to make up the number of students she's bringing. Now Karkaroff's made it a round dozen. Do that, Weatherby, will you? Mr. Crouch's eyes were bulging. He stood staring at the tree, muttering soundlessly at it. Then he staggered sideways and fell to his knees. "Mr. Crouch," Harry said loudly, "are you all right?" Crouch's eyes were rolling in his head. Harry looked around at Crumb, who had followed him into the trees, and he was looking down at Crouch in alarm. "What is wrong with him?" "No idea," Harry muttered. "Listen, you'd better go and get someone." "Dumbledore!" gasped Mr. Crouch. He reached out and seized a handful of Harry's robes, dragging him closer, though his eyes were staring over Harry's head. I need to see Dumbledore." "Okay," said Harry. If you get up, Mr. Crouch, we can go up to the... I've done a stupid thing," Mr. Crouch breathed. He looked utterly mad. His eyes were rolling and bulging, and a trickle of spittle was sliding down his chin. Every word he spoke seemed to cost him terrible effort. "Must tell Dumbledore." "Get up, Mr. Crouch," said Harry loudly and clearly. "Get up. I'll take you to Dumbledore." Mr. Crouch's eyes rolled forward onto Harry. "Who, you," he whispered. "I'm a student from the school," said Harry, looking around at Crumb for some help, but Crumb was backing up, looking extremely nervous. "You're not his," whispered Crouch, his mouth sagging. "No," said Harry, without the faintest idea of what Mr. Crouch was talking about. "Dumbledore's." "That's right," said Harry. Crouch was pulling him closer. Harry tried to loosen Crouch's grip on his robes, but it was too powerful. "Warn Dumbledore." "I'll get Dumbledore if you'll let go of me," said Harry. "Just let go, Mr. Crouch, and I'll go get him." "Thank you, Weatherby, and when you've done that, I would like a cup of tea. My wife and son will be arriving shortly. We are attending a concert tonight with Mr. and Mrs. Fudge." Crouch was now talking fluently to a tree and seemed completely unaware that Harry was there, which surprised Harry so much he didn't notice that Mr. Crouch released him. "Yes, my son has recently gained 12 owls. Most satisfactory. Yes, thank you. Yes, very proud indeed. Now, if you could bring me that memo from Andorin, Minister of Magic, I think I will have time to draft a response." "You stay here with him," Harry said to Crumb. "I'll go get Dumbledore. I'll be quicker. I know where the office is." "He's mad," said Crumb doubtfully, staring down at Crouch, who was still gabbling to a tree, apparently convinced it was Percy. "Just stay with him," said Harry, starting to get up, but his movement seemed to trigger another abrupt change in Mr. Crouch, who seized him hard around the knees and pulled Harry back down to the ground. Don't leave me," he whispered, his eyes bulging again. "I escaped. Must warn, must tell. See Dumbledore. My fault, all my fault. Bertha dead. All my fault. My son, my fault. Tell Dumbledore. Harry Potter, the Dark Lord, stronger. Harry Potter." "I'll go get Dumbledore if you'll let go of me, Mr. Crouch," said Harry. He looked furiously around at Crumb. "Help me, will you?" Looking extremely apprehensive, Crumb moved forward and squatted down next to Mr. Crouch. "Just keep him here," said Harry, pulling himself free of Mr. Crouch. "I'll be back with Dumbledore." "Hurry, won't you?" Crumb called after him as Harry sprinted away from the forest and up through the dark grounds. They were deserted. Bagman, Cedric, and Fleur had disappeared. Harry tore up the stone steps, through the oak front doors, and off up the marble staircase toward the second floor. 5 minutes later, he was hurtling towards a stone gargoyle standing halfway along an empty corridor. Lemon drop! He panted at it. This was the password to the hidden staircase to Dumbledore's office, or at least it had been 2 years ago. The password had evidently changed, however, for the stone gargoyle did not spring to life and jump aside, but stood frozen, glaring at Harry malevolently. "Move!" Harry shouted at it. "Come on!" But nothing at Hogwarts had ever just moved because he shouted at it. He knew it was no good. He looked up and down the dark corridor. Perhaps Dumbledore was in the staff room. He started running as fast as he could toward the staircase. "Potter!" Harry skidded to a halt and looked around. Snape had just emerged from the hidden staircase behind the stone gargoyle. The wall was sliding shut behind him even as he beckoned Harry back toward him. "What are you doing here, Potter?" I need to see Professor Dumbledore," said Harry, running back up the corridor and skidding to a standstill in front of Snape instead. "It's Mr. Crouch. He's just turned up. He's in the forest. He's asking—" "What is this rubbish?" said Snape, his black eyes glittering. "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Crouch!" Harry shouted. "From the Ministry! He's ill or something! He's in the forest! He wants to see Dumbledore! Just give me the password to the—" "The headmaster is busy, Potter," said Snape, his thin mouth curling into an unpleasant smile. "I've got to tell Dumbledore!" Harry yelled. "Didn't you hear me, Potter?" said Snape. Harry could tell Snape was thoroughly enjoying himself, denying Harry the thing he wanted when he was so panicky. "Look," said Harry angrily, "Crouch isn't right. He's out of his mind. He says he wants to warn—" The stone wall slid open behind Snape. Dumbledore was standing there, wearing long green robes and a mildly curious expression. "Is there a problem?" he said, looking between Harry and Snape. "Professor," Harry said, sidestepping Snape before Snape could speak, "Mr. Crouch is here. He's down in the forest. He wants to speak to you." Harry expected Dumbledore to ask questions, but to his relief, Dumbledore did nothing of the sort. "Lead the way," he said promptly, and he swept off along the corridor behind Harry, leaving Snape standing next to the gargoyle and looking twice as ugly. "What did Mr. Crouch say, Harry?" said Dumbledore as they walked swiftly down the marble staircase. "Says he wants to warn you, and he's done something terrible. He mentioned his son and Bertha Jorkins, and Voldemort. Something about Voldemort getting stronger." "Indeed," said said Dumbledore. And he quickened his pace as they hurried out into the pitch darkness. "He's not acting normally," Harry said, hurrying along beside Dumbledore. "He doesn't seem to know where he is. He keeps talking like he thinks Percy Weasley's there, and then he changes and he says he needs to see you. I left him with Victor Crumb." "You did?" said Dumbledore sharply, and he began to take longer strides still, so that Harry was running to keep up. "Do you know if anyone else saw Mr. Crouch?" "No," said Harry. "Crumb and I were talking. Mr. Bagman had just finished telling us about the third task. We stayed behind, and then we saw Mr. Crouch. We saw Mr. Crouch coming out of the forest." "Where are they?" said Dumbledore as the Beauxbaton carriage emerged from the darkness. "Over here," said Harry, moving in front of Dumbledore, leading the way through the trees. He couldn't hear Crouch's voice anymore, but he knew where he was going. It hadn't been much past the Beauxbaton carriage. "Somewhere around here." "Victor!" Harry shouted. No one answered. "They were here," Harry said to Dumbledore. "They were definitely somewhere around here." "Lumos," Dumbledore said, lighting his wand and holding it up. Its narrow beam traveled from black trunk to black trunk, illuminating the ground, and then it fell upon a pair of feet. Harry and Dumbledore hurried forward. Krum was sprawled on the forest floor. He seemed to be unconscious. There was no sign at all of Mr. Crouch. Dumbledore bent over Krum and gently lifted one of his eyelids. "Stunned," he said softly. His half-moon glasses glittered in the wand light as he peered around at the surrounding trees. Should I go and get someone?" said Harry. "Madame Pomfrey." "No," said Dumbledore swiftly. "Stay here." He raised his wand into the air and pointed it in the direction of Hagrid's cabin. Harry saw something silvery dart out of it and streak away through the trees like a ghostly bird. Then Dumbledore bent over again, pointed his wand at him, and muttered, "Everate." Krum opened his eyes. He looked dazed. When he saw Dumbledore, he tried to sit up, but Dumbledore put a hand on his shoulder and made him lie still. "He attacked me," Krum muttered, putting a hand up to his head. "The old madman attacked me. I was looking around to see where Potter had gone, and he attacked me from behind." "Lie still for a moment," Dumbledore said. The sound of thunderous footfalls reached them, and Hagrid came panting into sight with Fang at his heels. He was carrying his crossbow. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, his eyes widening. "Harry, what the—" "Hagrid, I need you to fetch Professor Karkaroff," said Dumbledore. "His student has been attacked. When you've done that, kindly alert Professor Moody." No need, Dumbledore," said a wheezy growl. "I'm here." Moody was limping toward them, leaning on his staff, his wand lit. "Darn leg," he said furiously. "Would have been quicker. What happened?" "Snape said something about Crouch." "Crouch?" said Hagrid blankly. "Karkaroff, please, Hagrid," said Dumbledore sharply. "Oh, yeah, right, your professor," said Hagrid, and he turned and disappeared into the dark trees. Fang trotted after him. "I don't know where Barty Crouch is," Dumbledore told Moody, "but it is essential we find him." "I'm on to it," growled Moody, and he pulled out his wand and limped off into the forest. Neither Dumbledore nor Harry spoke again until they heard the unmistakable sounds of Hagrid and Fang returning. Karkaroff was hurrying behind them. He was wearing his sleek silver furs, and he looked pale and agitated. "What is this?" he cried when he saw Krum on the ground and Dumbledore and Harry beside him. "What's going on?" "I was attacked," said Krum, sitting up now, rubbing his head. "Mr. Crouch, or whatever his name—" "Crouch attacked you? Crouch attacked you? Then try Wizard Judge." "Igor," Dumbledore began, but Karkaroff had drawn himself up, clutching his furs around him, looking livid. "Treachery!" he bellowed, pointing at Dumbledore. "It's a plot. You and your Ministry of Magic have lured me here under false pretense, Dumbledore. This is not an equal competition. First you sneak Potter into the tournament, though he is underage. Now one of your Ministry friends attempts to put my champion out of action. I smell double dealing and corruption in this whole affair, and you, Dumbledore, you with your talk of closer international—" Hold on, pages stack. Good grief. All right, so you, with your talk of closer international wizarding links and rebuilding old ties, of forgetting old differences, here's what I think of you. Karkaroff spat onto the ground at Dumbledore's feet. In one swift movement, Hagrid seized Karkaroff's front fur, lifted him into the air, and slammed him against a nearby tree. "Apologize!" Hagrid snarled at Karkaroff as Karkaroff gasped for breath. Hagrid's massive fist at his throat, his feet dangling in midair. "Hagrid, no!" Dumbledore shouted, his eyes flashing. Hagrid removed the hand pinning Karkaroff to the tree, and Karkaroff slid all the way down the trunk and slumped in a huddle at its roots. A few twigs and leaves showered upon his head. "Kindly escort Harry back up to the castle," said Dumbledore to Hagrid. Breathing heavily, Hagrid gave Karkaroff a glowering look. "Maybe I'd better stay here, Headmaster." "You will take Harry back to school, Hagrid," Dumbledore repeated firmly. "Take him right up to Gryffindor Tower, and Harry, I want you to stay there. Anything you might want to do, any owls you might want to send, they can wait until morning. Do you understand me?" Yes," said Harry, staring at him. How had Dumbledore known that at that very moment he had been thinking about sending Pigwidgeon straight to Sirius to tell him what had happened? "I'll leave Fang with you, Headmaster," Hagrid said, staring menacingly at Karkaroff, who was still sprawled at the foot of the tree, tangled in furs and tree roots. "Stay, Fang. Come on, Harry." They marched in silence past the Beauxbaton carriage and up toward the castle. "How dare he?" Hagrid growled as they strode past the lake. "How dare he accuse Dumbledore? Like Dumbledore do anything like that. Like Dumbledore wanted you in the tournament in the first place. Worried? I don't know when I'd seen Dumbledore more worried than he's been lately. And you," Hagrid suddenly said angrily to Harry, who looked up at him, taken aback. "What were you doing wandering off with Ruddy Crumb? He's from Durmstrang, Harry. Could have jinxed you right there, couldn't he? Hasn't Moody taught you nothing? Imagine letting him lure you off on your own." "Crumb's all right," said Harry as they climbed the steps into the entrance hall. "He wasn't trying to jinx me. He just wanted to talk about Hermione." "I'll be having a few words with her, all right," said Hagrid grimly, stomping up the stairs. "The less you lot have to do with those foreigners, the happier you'll be. You can't trust any of 'em." "You were getting on all right with Madame Maxine," Harry said, annoyed. "Don't you talk to me about her," said Hagrid, and he looked quite frightening for a moment. "I've got her number now. Trying to get back in good books, trying to get me to tell her what's coming in the third task. Ha! You can't trust any of 'em." Hagrid was in such a bad mood. Harry was quite glad to say goodbye to him in front of the fat lady. He clambered through the portrait hole into the common room and hurried straight for the corner where Ron and Hermione were sitting to tell them what had happened. All right, that is the end of chapter 28. I'll see you soon. Bye.